Hello, welcome to our webinar. We're excited to launch a new compendium today of national EIA recognition schemes and to give you a preview. My name is Bridget John and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. We are the leading global network on best practice for using impact assessment to make informed decisions. Our presentation today is part of a webinar program we initiated in 2016, and I invite you to visit our website and check out the recordings of a few of our more recent webinars. You can see a sampling of some of the names there. We've got webinars on emerging technologies, biodiversity, indigenous peoples, social impact assessment, health, resettlement, and more. So you can see the web address there, so we invite you to check that out. Also, if you're so inclined and you want to tweet something about today's webinar, we invite you to do that. Our handle is @IAIA Network and the hashtag is IAIA Webinar. A few bits of housekeeping before we jump into our presentation today. Yes, we are recording our webinar today, and we will make the recording available to you afterwards. You'll receive a link automatically just by being registered. It is a 45-minute webinar today. There will be about 30 minutes of presentation with 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Please enter your questions at any time in the control panel on the right that you see there. I will be monitoring those throughout the webinar, and I will pose those to Josh at the end. We do have the slides made available for you. You can find those in the handout pane, also in your control panel. And the link to the compendium itself is provided in the slides a couple different times. And while Josh is speaking, I will post that into the chat pane as well. So you'll have a hot link right there. And speaking of Josh, he is indeed our presenter today. Josh Fothergill is founder and director of Fothergill Training and Consulting Limited. He led the research and the development of the compendium that we're talking about today. Josh has nearly 20 years of impact assessment and capacity building experience. Previously, he acted as the head of professional standards for the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, or IAIA, in the UK. He has a keen interest in how skills and capability development relate to quality improvements in impact assessment systems, and he's helped develop a number of ESIA-related professional recognition schemes, including creating the UK's EIA Quality Mark scheme. So without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Josh to get us started.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for that introduction. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. As Bridget mentioned, I'm Josh Fothergill, founder and director of Fothergill Training and Consulting, and I led the research alongside Ross Marshall, and I'll be guiding you through today's slides. I'll talk to you a little bit more about the team of us who conducted undertook this research and the compendium as we move through. Just to say, in terms of my links to IAIA, I've been involved with the International Association for over a decade now. I was formerly the chair of the Ireland and UK branch here in the United Kingdom. My first conference was actually a symposium over in Calgary on cumulative effects assessment back in 2008, and that really gave me the bug to keep engaging with the IAIA. I've been to, I think, around 10 different activities. Unfortunately, not necessarily made the conference every year, but certainly some of the symposia, and spoken a couple of times at some Washington DC events as well. So strongly encourage those of you who are listening who are IAIA members to keep engaging, and if there are members people out there who are listening who aren't IAIA, then please do learn more about the organization. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the Compendium of National EIA Professional Recognition Schemes, and what I'll be talking to you about, I suppose, is kind of broken down into 3 different areas. So I'll talk to you initially for around 10 minutes about the research itself. So what was the inspiration behind looking at this particular area? What activities did we do in order to gain the innovation grant and deliver this project? What was the project team who put this work together? And then we'll move on to talk about the findings. Findings really, initially we'll start with the kind of facts and figures. How many schemes did we find in different countries? Which countries did we conclude schemes weren't likely to be present? Then we'll talk some more about some of the details and characteristics within those schemes, and then talk about some of perhaps the wider trends that are going on, both in terms of the requirements across schemes, but also in terms of, I suppose, the wider direction within kind of the impact assessment policy and kind of practice realm. And then finally, I'll spend around the last 10 minutes talking about the compendium itself. So explaining what the report contains, highlighting the country sheets and your ability to get involved in those. The research wasn't just about creating a static thing, but really about creating the start of something for members to engage with, share their knowledge, build upon, and hopefully create a real hub of knowledge within the IAIA's web pages about these different professional recognition schemes. And then we'll talk about perhaps some of the kind of future activities and where we go from here, including opportunities for conversations with Ross Marshall, who will be attending the Brisbane conference in May, and also the possibility of continuing this conversation at IAIA 2020 in Seville. And then finally, we'll obviously have the opportunity for Q&A. So the research itself, it was about we had to focus it. There was obviously only so much time we could put into this, and the innovation grants are really about doing a kind of focused piece of research that helps move practice forward. So we focused on project-based environmental impact assessment, and we wanted to understand what were the kind of competency requirements across both national schemes and international schemes, and kind of improve the amount of information that was out there across the impact assessment community about these type of schemes. You know, kind of there seemed to be an impression from conversations at IAIA conferences that there were quite a few of these schemes out there, but certainly when myself and Ross tried to look into this in a little bit more detail, we often found some very good studies, but perhaps they'd looked at 10 or 15 particular nations or locations or situations, and it was hard to get a real grasp of perhaps the global direction on this. So that's what we were hoping to achieve. We did have to focus it in. So really, I suppose, in effect, we were trying to compile what exists in relation to this information to form a better understanding of what schemes exist, where they exist, and where we feel they, from the data we gathered, they probably don't exist, and you know what's behind these schemes. To be clear, what we weren't trying to do was judge the quality of these schemes. That wasn't part of the focus of the research. So we're not really trying to make any judgments on these schemes. It's really about kind of finding that information and bringing it out so that hopefully it can be explored and unpacked by others in the future. So in terms of our inspiration for the research, or I suppose I should really say my inspiration for the research, because I can't speak for Ross, but if you do get a chance to speak with him in Brisbane, I'm sure he'd share a similar passion for kind of the need for competence and capability around impact assessment, and I guess a kind of shared agreement that fundamentally practice can only be as good as the individual and organisational capacity, both for the understanding and delivery of impact assessment, but also in understanding and being able to use the outcomes of that process to better manage the environmental and social risks that happen during construction, operation, and later on in a project. So in terms of my context, my personal context, I had this interest. Where did it come from? Well, I guess, you know, fundamentally, perhaps, you know, this interest, I had an interest in geography and what was going on in the world and human impacts within it, which is what led me to impact assessment. But around 2008, I joined an organisational professional body in the UK called IAIA, and I created what is known as the EIA Quality Mark Scheme, which was one of the reasons that IAIMA won the Global Institution Award from IAIA in 2012. And this was a scheme for organisations, so it wasn't the individual EIA recognition schemes that this research is looking at, but it was looking about how do we get those organisations to come together, release time from their staff, so that we can have a more active community in the UK around EIA. For my part, when I was at IAIMA, I spent 18 months also acting as the head of professional standards, so not just doing policy and practice and impact assessment, but kind of managing the direction of professional standards for around 15,000 environment and sustainability professionals. And that really fascinated me as to what were these skills needs in order to kind of move forward to a more sustainable economy, the kind of behavioural type aspects that you might see, the kind of systems thinking, the collaboration, the communication, alongside the kind of core EIA knowledge that we have. And I guess that kind of raised for me a kind of context of, well, where are we within EIA in terms of capabilities and expectations? Now, that was combined with the International Association for Impact Assessment and my experiences of joining in with IAIA activities. I mentioned the 2012 conference in Porto, and that's when I first really had kind of strong contact with the Hong Kong Institute of EIA, and that led to a kind of memorandum of understanding and various activities for a good 3 or 4 years, and kind of conversations about quality requirements and those kind of things. And I'd like to think in some small way, those conversations help to support Hong Kong in developing its qualified environmental professional or qualified environmental practitioner voluntary standard that relates to impact assessment, as well as other environmental specialist areas that was developed in the years after 2012. Also, IAIA was where I met with some of the Netherlands Commission for Environmental Assessment staff and saw the kind of work that they were doing to help build capacity around the world, bringing people both to the Netherlands, but also undertaking activity in various countries that they operate in, and seeing the country data sheets. And those data sheets were incredibly useful for the project, and I'll highlight those a little more in a minute. And then one thing I guess that really put the crux behind this was Nagoya conference in 2016. I think it was JICA and the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and a number of others had a session where they signed the principles of collaboration for country safeguard systems. And this was really interesting to me, this move to country safeguard systems. So moving away from necessarily having to meet performance standards from the IFC or the environmental and social safeguards and standards from the World Bank to trusting the country safeguards, and how much you would have to, if you change that risk profile and rely on those requirements in a country, how much you're also then having to rely on the capability to deliver under that regulatory system or those requirements, which again emphasise, I suppose, the need for skills and capacity, and got me thinking about this what exists out there. So just to highlight the Commission's country profiles, if you're not aware of these, Netherlands Commission for Environmental Assessment, you can see the web link there, and they don't have every country in the world, but they have quite a number of countries, and they give information, if they have it, on EIA and SEA, and within that was a very kind of useful core resource for this project, because there is an indication there of kind of presence or absence around a number of countries, competency requirements or professional recognition schemes. So we found that very, very useful as a kind of data check for quite a number of the findings from the project. So in terms of the research itself, in terms of the project, the timelines, it was funded by an IAIA research grant in the first year they came out in 2017. And these innovation grants are designed, as it indicates there, to kind of fund things that will advance something of value to the impact assessment community, but they have to be delivered in quite a short kind of timescale. So, you know, this isn't about kind of long-term PhD type funding. This is about, are there some very kind of specific type activities that can help move practice forward, help give us a better understanding of things. So myself and Ross, who I'll introduce on the next slide, bid in early 2017 and were thankfully successful. And therefore our project activities through 2017 involved us developing the scope of the project. What would we look at? What would we focus on? And we had some conversations with the board at IAIA Montreal in 2017. We then data gathered both at that conference and then using a survey and then follow-up conversations with contacts we already had or had made through the IAIA network. We then analysed and assessed all that content that we'd gathered in through a couple of months in September and October, and reported that in a kind of draft of the compendium and a document to the board that kind of explained how we'd usefully spent the research grant and what we'd found in I suppose a little bit of an executive summary back in November 2017. Now, there's obviously been a little bit of a gap in terms of kind of moving to where we are today. That was to make sure that the document could kind of be finalised and all approved and produce these data sheets that we'll talk about later. So there was a certain degree of follow-up and updating. I went down to Durban in 2018 and was able to gather information on 3 or 4 additional countries. During that time also, the South African scheme that had been a voluntary scheme for many, many years had been formalised. And as a consequence of which there was a need for some updates, which continued through to this February, where we kind of put a kind of full stop in the document and said it's time to get it launched. Let's make sure it's out there for the members for Brisbane, which leads us to today. So the project team or the core project team, those names on the research grant proposal was myself kind of leading the activity, and Ross Marshall, who's the owner of a consultancy called Leading Green. Many of you will know him as a former president of the IAIA himself. So we undertook the majority of the work, some of which was obviously supported by the grants and many hours of interesting discussion in the village. We both live in the same village over here in the UK. But also there was a lot of kind of, I suppose, additional support. So many thanks to to yourselves as IAIA members who took part in the survey, to the staff and the board at IAIA HQ, and then also our key contacts across China, Hong Kong, South Africa, Australia and beyond, who provided us with some of the initial impetus for the scheme. So that's the context. To really move on to the findings, so we'll talk about the presence or absence of these schemes within countries. We'll talk about the data that we gathered and the forms that these are presented in, and the data sheets. And then finally, we'll get on to the trends that come out of this, both in terms of the wider policy trends, but also from the data that we picked up. So moving on, in terms of simple presence or absence, so we're talking about schemes that recognise individuals, so these are individual people, in order to undertake environmental impact assessment or to recognise their capabilities in relation to project-based environmental impact assessment. So we did focus and limit ourselves down a bit. And the previous studies that we'd been able to identify and find, I think rarely found above kind of 20 locations or gathered information on kind of 20 locations around the world. We were able to really push this forward through the survey engagement with members and then follow-on conversations after Montreal. And we were able to get to a point where we'd identified and were fairly confident with the situation we'd identified in 73 of the world's 195 countries. So nearly 40%, over a third of the world's countries, this research has now been able to kind of get a reasonable confidence as to whether there is a presence of a scheme for individuals undertaking Project EIA to register, or whether such a scheme doesn't exist in that country. Now, that for the ones where it's absent, that doesn't mean there isn't any kind of registration scheme. In fact, in quite a lot of countries, we find that there was organisational registration schemes, but perhaps not an individual scheme. And in some cases, we found countries where there was both individual and organisational registration. But our focus was very much on that individual side of things, the recognition of a practitioner's skills rather than their organisation. And we were able to identify that 41 locations around the world did have these schemes. And the reason there's a difference there between locations and countries is because there were 40 countries, but then in addition, as I mentioned earlier, Hong Kong within China has its own Hong Kong Institute of Qualified Environmental Professionals scheme, which the Hong Kong Institute of EIA, which is a separate body, is one of the founding members of. We were also able to kind of be fairly confident that in 35 different locations around the world, that summed to 33 countries in total, there weren't these individual schemes present in those locations, but as I indicated, there may well be organisational schemes. And the difference there between those, again, one of the situations was China, where Macau doesn't have a scheme as far as we could identify, but mainland China does have its own registration scheme. And then also the other one was within Belgium, where Brussels and Wallonia regions don't have schemes, but Flanders does have one. So if we move on from that to look at into a bit more detail of those locations where we did find schemes or find evidence of schemes and were sufficiently confident to say one existed, we then asked a range of questions through survey, through contact with individuals, to try and find additional data about what was behind these schemes. What were the requirements to register? Once you were registered, was there any other expectation? Were you on there for life, or did you have to renew? Was there a fee, and these kind of things? And in many cases, in 24 cases, we were able to generate some useful data that allowed us to kind of cross-analyze between the schemes. But for 17 of them, we weren't able to find that data, or at least not sufficient of it to allow us to really move forward into the analysis side of things. So now we're moving forward into just those 24 where there was an individual scheme and we got some data and information about them that gave us confidence. So we found there were two main forms of recognition scheme. There was a regulatory scheme, so this would be government-led, required in legislation that you need to be part of the register in order to practice or to deliver a specific role within the EIA system. And the majority of locations, 20 of the 24, were regulatory schemes, so 19 countries plus the Flanders region within Belgium. The other form of scheme was a voluntary scheme. So this wasn't set out by the government, it wasn't set out in the legislation, it was often led by a kind of professional body or a non-governmental organisation, and it often offered wider benefits than just the recognition process. And I guess that isn't surprising, because if there's not a requirement for you to sign up to this recognition scheme, there needs to be some additional benefit, be that some kind of market recognition by some kind of logo, or the opportunity to kind of access a kind of community of practice and conversations. So this information was all compiled, and they were compiled onto what we're calling scheme data sheets. So here's an example of one just for China. So you'll see up in the top, you've got the information about which country it is, the fact that there is one present, an individual EIA scheme present in the country. In the case of China, it's a legal requirement. This is the organizer or the part of the government that runs that. A link that takes you to the relevant page, unfortunately only available in Chinese, but the in-country expert who was helping us was able to direct us to what that link was. We're able to provide a brief description, some are longer than others, and then some requirements around competency for that scheme, what you have to do to apply for that scheme, or the information that we're able to gather, and then an indication of once you're operational, once you're in that scheme, how long are you able to stay on that scheme. So in China's case, in the operational side, there is a time limit, there is a need for renewal, there's an expectation that you'll do some kind of annual CPD return, etc. And then over here on the sheet, we have metadata. about who compiled the original, what version it was and when it was produced, and whether we're seeking further verification. And in this case, there were some questions that we had, so there is a desire to get a little bit of further verification from those working in China's impact EIA field to add some more in. So this is what we produce for those 24 different locations where we had data. That then gave us an ability to analyze things. So if we begin to then look at some of the trends and the information that are set out in the compendium, in terms of regulatory schemes, I suppose we obviously in the report discuss some of these trends, but this is perhaps one of the key diagrams. And what we find here is perhaps the top 5 of those in the table have quite a lot of detailed requirements, quite a lot of similar requirements in relation to them. So not just the kind of core areas of demonstrating some experience and qualifications, but also some additional supplementary requirements in order to get onto registration in the first place, either some pre-registration examination or training or some kind of verification. Plus there's requirements, if we look at perhaps the first 10 down to around Kenya, and a general expectation of a renewal period or a need to follow a code of practice. And then you'll see as we get further down the table, we did get more limited in terms of the data available, but certainly the commonality was this demonstration of EIA experience and some form of kind of academic qualification being evidenced. So that tended to be a focus for the regulatory schemes, and we're able to do a similar kind of focus onto the voluntary schemes, but I won't go into the detail of that. You can find that in the compendium. However, you will find on the voluntary schemes there's far more consistency, far fewer schemes, but far more consistency of an expectation to follow a code of practice and provide ongoing evidence of CPD, which that acronym means continuing professional development, effectively ongoing learning and training by the individual. So if we move on to think about what trends exist in relation to such schemes, first I'll just talk about some of the wider global trends I suppose we identified, partly as relation to the research, partly more widely. So in terms of global trends, there's been a number of legislative systems with expectations around professional expertise. That's risen quite a lot in the last 5 years. I guess really kind of driven quite a lot by the European Union's directive changes in 2014 that set out requirements under Article 5.3 for an expectation that those who write the environmental impact statements should be competent experts, and those who examine that for the consenting authority should have sufficient expertise in order to examine that document. And that's obviously kind of applied an expectation on the 28 member states in Europe, and will have some wider kind of impetus and influence beyond that, seeing what's come into the European legislation. There's also increasing competency expectations in some of the wider arena. DFID here in the UK, the Department for International Development, has expectations of its staff around competence. The World Bank's Environmental Social Framework has numerous references to capability and competence, in particular under ESS 9, which is about the financial intermediaries, and an expectation that environmental and social management systems that they operate will contain some information as to how they're ensuring that those who are delivering different parts of that management system or different requirements under the loan agreement actually have the capability to deliver the environmental and social management practices that are set out there. And a similar kind of expectation come into the ISO Environmental Management System standard that was updated in 2015 about this requirement for those who run an ISO 14001 accredited environmental management system to have an understanding of kind of capability and competence through their system. What is notable is that some of the newer schemes are perhaps moving beyond pure EIA knowledge and experience to also bring in more of an expectation around some of the key skills that perhaps we as kind of EIA or impact assessment coordinators need, the sound judgment, the risk management, the collaboration, the communication type things. In terms of regulatory versus voluntary, there was a common core. in terms of expectations for these schemes: years of experience, academic qualifications, a fee to pay to apply, and some example of kind of EIA knowledge, or core skills in relation to environmental impact assessment. The voluntary schemes, as I indicated earlier, were all run by a professional body, and they all showed multiple levels of recognition and a need for a code of practice. So I guess it was giving that individual a bit of a kind of a ladder, a career ladder of how they could advance themselves forward and move up in terms of their recognition around EIA. There was also an expectation for this ongoing learning, evidenced and supported ongoing learning, to show that you've not just kind of been able to pass the requirements, but also you are keeping yourself up to date in relation to your EIA capabilities. On the regulatory side, the majority of this was central government managed. Levels, codes of practice, CPD, were often absent. In fact, code of practice and CPD was only kind of included in less than a third of these regulatory schemes. So that kind of ongoing learning requirement was perhaps less focused on, but there was often a need for renewal. So a renewal period of less than 5 years, I guess that in a way replacing, showing that you are still involved in practice, but not necessarily showing how you are maintaining your skills. So for the final 5 minutes, I just wanted to talk about the compendium. So its launch, the materials, and the next steps. In terms of the launch, well, there's a link down the bottom there, and as Bridget mentions, that will be available in your resources section. The compendium looks like that. It's a report around, I think it's around 20 or 30 pages that talks about the study and presents those diagrams plus more data, goes into more detail about the trends. There are these various data sheets, and we have around 24 of these, and they're growing, which is great. I'll explain in a moment why they're growing. So we have these data sheets for the 24 countries, and you can access those individually and find out the information about the schemes in those countries. And then you can, if you wish, go back to the core data from the survey. We've published the whole lot, so you can go back to that core data in Appendix C and kind of really get into the detail of it. And that's all available on that web link there. Now, what we have also done is produced a blank scheme sheet. And one of the aspirations of this research was to not just kind of provide a basis as to where we are and try and move forward our understanding of what schemes exist around the world, but also then provide the opportunity for where we do have gaps or where the data wasn't as high quality that we could gather as we'd wanted. It gives you the opportunity as members who know your country or know a country that you work within to input more information. So Appendix B has this blank sheet. It gives you some advice. You can find that on the IAIA website where the report is. It gives you advice on how to fill this in. It's very simple. I'll show you the form in a moment, and you simply return it to info@iaia.org, and between myself and HQ, we'll work out how we advance those, but they'll certainly make themselves onto the website. So effectively, it's a PDF form that you can edit, and you can go in and add in the details for each area for your country and give in the details, and then you put your name and information in. If you want to amend something that's already there, you would need to put in the original kind of name, which would generally be myself and Ross, but then add in your details and put the correct or updated information in the main bit and submit it to us. Clearly, the more information you can provide on web links and kind of where this is verified from and that kind of thing, the more easy it will be for us to verify that and put those online. So you can help. These are the countries where we found there was evidence of a scheme through the data that we've been able to collect, but we didn't have enough information to feel confident to put a data sheet out there for these countries. So for Belize or Albania or Botswana to Zambia and Zanzibar, etc., we had some evidence, some indication that there was a scheme. We were confident that, in that, but we didn't have enough confidence in what the requirements of that scheme were. So we're asking for your help here to kind of, I guess, keep this project alive and kind of turn this into more of a community activity. And what's great is actually you can help. You already have helped, in fact, and thank you very much to the members who've already engaged since the email went out on Monday. So Ethiopia, we've already had a form filled in for Ethiopia post-launch, giving us some updates. And fantastically, we've also added Uruguay. So there is a voluntary registration scheme we've been informed in Uruguay, and we now have a data sheet in relation to that, which is fantastic. So you can help. People are already helping. If you work in one of these countries and know some more information about the scheme, please go and fill in a form. If you work in a country that isn't covered by the project, please again go in and fill a form. And we've also had one completed for Tanzania. That was one of the countries where we'd already identified there was a scheme, but someone knew more detail about it than we've been able to gather in the research, and they've already provided us with an updated form. So that's fantastic. We'd really like to see more of that. That was really an aspiration from the project. So moving forward, let me just get my mouse working again. In terms of thinking about the future, clearly there's the opportunity to fill in the data sheets, to expand our knowledge beyond the 73 countries that we found out about at the moment, to update our knowledge. The South African scheme moving from voluntary to regulatory. I think I got the gist of it when I was in Durban, but I think it would be fantastic if someone from South Africa could look at that form and decide whether it's as accurate as it could be. But there is the opportunity to expand this. The form wouldn't take much effort to modify it so it looked at organisational EIA schemes, or perhaps HIA recognition schemes, or those for social impact assessment, or SEA. So there could be the opportunity for members to take this forward and expand this out and create a real hub on the IAIA website for this. Then there's the opportunities through the conferences and IAIA Connect. So as I mentioned, Ross Marshall will be over in Brisbane at IAIA 19 in a couple of months' time. He's running a training course on impact assessment leadership. If you're looking for something to do before the conference, that'd be a fantastic capacity building opportunity for you. There will also be a poster in the poster session about this research. And then in Seville in 2020 is talking about smartening impact assessment. Now, perhaps that means smart cities, but I'm going to take it as meaning building capacity, encouraging a conversation about capacity building. So there'll be opportunities in coming months up until July for sessions, more towards October this year for presentations around these kind of areas to continue this conversation on capacity building. I'll certainly be going to Seville and looking to talk on this subject. It'd be fantastic to see you there, and hopefully we could all have more conversations. So in summary, I think what we felt before the study, but certainly emphasised by the study, is competence is critical for effective impact assessment. Recognition schemes do provide a focus and impetus towards competency, but there's certainly no guarantee of quality in themselves, and that wasn't what we were focusing on. But there is a good presence of them around the world, and there certainly seems to be an increasing interest in use of recognising competency or expecting competency through standards like the World Bank's ESF and ISO 14001, and through regulatory mechanisms like the EIA directive. So that might push more emphasis towards these formalised schemes. For research and these type of activities, you guys as IAIA members are a hugely valuable data resource. You were by far the best data source we could access. The Compendium provides that potential to build and maintain this complete record, and our future conferences and symposia with IAIA have that opportunity to kind of keep that momentum going. So that's all from me. Apologies, I've spoken for a couple of minutes over, but now I'm going to hand back to Bridget and answer any questions you might have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Josh, for a great presentation. I'm sure everyone in the audience enjoyed it. We do indeed have a few questions that have come in, and please continue to post your questions in the question panel, and we'll get them as many posted to Josh as we can. So the first question that we have, Josh, comes from Victor, and he's interested to know how many countries we have no data for and why. He's thinking that 24 countries seems to be very small, considering that from his experience, some of the least developed countries often have quite stringent requirements related to ESIA.
Yes, certainly. So the research grant was, these are projects that are meant to be delivered within kind of 6 to 9 months, and it's quite a focused kind of budget and piece of work. So we had to kind of identify ways of getting data, finding this information about systems and what existed out there. So we chose a survey methodology, we chose reaching out to connections, and we chose conversations at the Montreal conference, and then some follow-up at Durban. And this did provide us with a decent amount of access. As I indicated, we got information on 73 of the 195 countries. So there were, yes, the 40 countries where we found presence of these schemes, but there were also the 33 countries, don't forget, where we were confident that these schemes on an individual basis didn't exist. So we got to around 40%, close to 40% of the world's countries. Absolutely, there's more to get. There's some very large countries out there that we don't necessarily have information about, and it would be fantastic to fill in that information gap. And I think to an extent, one of the aspirations of this project was to try and stimulate the IAIA membership to see the opportunity of creating this hub and this accessible information, and hopefully with having moved from kind of not having this data available through IAIA and only been able to find perhaps 10 or 20 countries in different research papers around the world to bringing it together to have this information on around 70, it gives us that possibility with the data sheets to start pushing forward and really build this up. So hopefully that answers Victor's question. And hopefully it inspires more people like the members who've already responded with Tanzania, Uruguay, Ethiopia, etc., so that we can continue to build up this knowledge area. Yeah.
Amanda is asking if you found that the schemes that exist require government officials who review the EIAs to be equally complying with requirements set on environmental practitioners outside of government, and for example, those who provide a service to developers.
It's a good question. The analysis and the way we were able to gather information did try and delineate between whether the scheme was open to all or whether it was focused on the kind of decision-making side, the formal kind of competent authority side of things, or whether it was the more consultant, the developer side of things. In most cases, we were indicated that schemes were open to all. However, the data did seem to, when we were able to get into to look at some of those and read some of the regulations and requirements, the focus did seem to be more often on the consultants working for the developer or undertaking the assessment process and compiling the environmental impact statement to be registered or recognised, rather than those who are actually working on the decision maker side. It's interesting, the 2014 amendments to the European Directive, which applies to the 28 member states as Europe is, or the European Union is at the moment, that has expectations on both sides. So for those 28 countries, there is an expectation for competent experts within the delivery of the environmental impact statement, and then sufficient expertise within the government body who's making that consent decision. However, they stepped back. The original proposal was for an accreditation system, but unfortunately Europe stepped back from that. So it's a much less formal system, although there is an expectation on both sides within Europe. There isn't necessarily a requirement for formal schemes to deliver that.
All right. We had a couple questions. We want to know, people who want to know if, in your experience or in your opinion, is a global or universal impact assessment scheme possible?
Ooh, now that's an interesting and potentially loaded question. This is very much my own personal experience and my own personal opinion, so I'm certainly not talking on behalf of IAIA here. I think there is opportunity to look at the similarities in need around skills and knowledge to deliver effective impact assessments and try and get some cross-recognition recognition between the schemes that exist at the moment. Now, I think that's very challenging when these schemes are regulatory, because in the end they link back to a formal legal process, and that links into the courts within each individual country. But perhaps for some of these more voluntary schemes, I think there could be more opportunity to certainly have conversations and build similarities. Whether these voluntary schemes have enough breadth and coverage to make it useful to have eventually move to a point where you could transfer kind of membership between them, I think would be interesting to see if we could get there. But actually implementing a single global scheme, I think, would generate quite a number of challenges, particularly if you wanted it to go into any level of depth because of the specific regulatory needs and links that exist in different countries.
All right, well, we have time for one more question. There's so many that we didn't get to, but thank you so much for posting them. Last question, what is the difference between recognition and competency?
Okay, so again, interesting question. I guess it depends where your standpoint is and where you're coming from. For me, a recognition scheme is giving someone, in this case, because we're talking about individuals, it's giving someone a badge that says you have met certain requirements, and ideally those requirements are lining up to say you are capable of undertaking an EIA, whereas competency is the actual ability to do it, to actually deliver it. So these recognition schemes are trying to break that ability to do it down into a number of predefined requirements, boxes, years of experience, academic qualifications, whatever else it might be, in order to kind of say, well, those are all indicators of someone's competence to actually deliver an effective EIA or an acceptable EIA, depending on how detailed the scheme is. So the competency is the actual ability of the individual to do it and to deliver EIA effectively in the context that they're working in, whereas the recognition would be more the badge that might be associated with that. And as I say, we didn't judge whether the schemes we were looking at actually delivered competency out of their recognition. We didn't look at the quality of their processes.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh, for a fantastic presentation, and to the audience for participating. Just a few things to wrap up. We know we're running just a few minutes over, but we do have a slide that shows again where you can find the compendium as well as the data sheets for countries, and you can submit, as Josh mentioned. We're relying on your help to increase the information we have, so you can submit information for a new country. There's a link there, but it also shows where on our website to find it at iai.org. There's a tab for resources and publications, and then other reference and guide. Also, if it's not too late to register for II 19, as Josh mentioned, Ross Marshall will be there presenting both a training course, but also a poster specific to this research project from the Innovation Grant. And so the registration deadline is April 5th. The conference page is there. We encourage you all to show up and take a look at it. We would love to see you there. It's going to be a fantastic conference. So with that, again, a final thank you to Josh, and a thank you to our audience as well for the great participation and the questions that you had. In a day or two, you will receive a link to the recording of the webinar. You can access the slides now in the handouts, but also there will be a link to that in the link to the recording. So if you missed it, he'll have another chance at it. Also, there will be a brief survey that you'll be asked to complete when you leave. Really short. We just ask for your feedback. Just take a minute or two. It's really helpful to us to improve our service to you. So with that, thank you finally for everything, for your time. We know that your time is valuable, and we hope that this was valuable to you as well. See you next time.